Tonight's class, my computer wouldn't let me on. Then when I got on my computer, my Zoom wouldn't let me on. And I knew it's going to be a great class. And that's why. And it was. Hope you can make it. So this week's Parsha is Parshas Yisro, Parshat Yitro. And I was thinking, instead of doing what I usually do, which is sort of thinking about maybe the major themes or stories, I said, I'm going to go all the way to the end, because sort of unusual to start at the end, but I'm like, the final pasuk, the final verse is really the culmination of the whole story. And this is a very big story. I mean, this is Yisro, this is the giving of the Torah. So what is the last verse in the Parsha talking about? Very interesting. It's interesting, especially if you think of it contextually, like this is a really big Parsha. This is giving of the Torah Parsha. So the giving of the Torah Parsha, what is that final verse? And the final verse is actually a halacha. It's a law. It's about the construction of the tabernacle and the temple. And the law is that they had to construct a ramp for the priest to ascend to the altar. The altar was quite high, and the priests ascended, and then they actually stood on the peripheral edge of the altar, and they would throw in the incense, the blood, the meats, the fats, but they didn't go up on steps. They went up by a ramp. And the verse tells you what? Asher lo tigale ervascha alav, that your nakedness not be uncovered on it. Now, what does that mean? What that means is, if there were steps, you'd be spreading your legs wider to go from step to step, and that could be immodest. And we're like, immodest? Wait a minute. There's two reasons why that doesn't seem to jive in our brain. First of all, they were wearing pants. You know, if you see a priest and you see the pictures and the garments and you see this long cloak, you could think, okay, maybe, you know, they wore pants. So nothing was exposed if they would walk on steps. And the second point is, and what are we talking about being exposed to? We're concerned about the feelings of the stairs, that the stairs shouldn't feel uncomfortable with the priest's exposure if they weren't wearing pants or they are wearing pants. So what in the world is this point here? But this is a halacha, this is a law, this is a lot of details on the ramp and the construction. This is very, very real. And what we're being told here is, in God's temple, this is God's temple. This is a holy place. We're highlighting modesty. We don't want those priests to take wider steps that stairs would require. We rather have a ramp, so they'll be smaller, more modest, more discreet steps. Because if they weren't wearing pants, which of course they are, and if they weren't wearing pants, they couldn't do the service anyway. And we wouldn't want even the stones of the steps to see immodesty. And I was like, wow. And this is the final verse of the whole portion, which is a portion of the giving of the Torah. This is a huge portion. And it's emphasizing modesty, and especially modesty in God's temple. We want to be God's temple. We want our homes to be God's temple. How can I be God's temple? How can my house be God's temple here in Chicago? Because the verse says, V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. Make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in them. And the sages say, make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in it. What's this? In them. And the sages say that God is saying every single Jew could be God's temple. In our heart, in our minds, every one of us could be a temple for God. And surely our homes, every single one of our homes could be God's temple. Make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in them, in each house, in each heart, in each mind. Which means that our homes, ourselves, need a level of modesty, just as God wanted in his original home. Now, I said before we started the recording, but I maybe didn't say it officially enough, so I want to backtrack to say that the class tonight is dedicated in honor of the birthday of my husband, Eliezer ben Chaim Drezel, and the yahrzeit of my grandfather, Avram Tzvi Hirsch ben Aharon Halevi. A Levi, someone who could serve in the God's temple. We all want our homes to be that temple. This is a really special request of God. God wants each one of us to be his temple, each one of us to be a sanctuary, each one of us to be a tabernacle. And he wants each one of us to have the modesty that would allow him to be comfortable dwelling inside of us, inside of our home. So this is a really big thing God wants from us, and it really affects every part of us. And it's really challenging for most of us, one way or another. There's a lot of different aspects to modesty, and it can be challenging. And I think something we sometimes need to frame for all those things that are challenging, like getting on the class tonight was challenging for me. And I said to myself, the more difficult, the more significant. It's going to be a great class for someone, at least. Someone needs to hear this. And it's difficult, it's important. It's true for all the commandments. Whenever there's one that especially challenges us, and we might have a number that especially challenge us, the more difficult, the more significant. And this commandment specifically, we know actually has a very special power in terms of impacting children. It brings blessings for children. For many of us, it's very, very much in our heart. When we're thinking of the blessings we want for God, we want blessings for our children. So we are told that modesty has a very strong connection to blessing the children. And on a more pragmatic level, if you will, our modesty is a living example for our children of serving God. It's very visible modesty. Modesty can be in clothing, modesty can be in speech, modesty can be in actions. There's lots and lots and lots of nuances of modesty. And it's a very visible, constant message. We believe in God and we serve him. And as I said earlier, prior to this, we had a Zoom, live and Zoom, a birthday party for my husband, and having children in various places in the world and various time zones. It was very special, and it sort of evokes in my mind this concept that right now, for those of you that your children are still somewhat younger or maybe not and living at home, or most of them at home, and it's sometimes not clear to see your impact on your children. You know, they get annoyed with you, you might get annoyed with them. There might be stresses, frictions, annoyances. It's not always easy for us to see impact. But as you day by day live a certain way, that impact is there. And sometimes, honestly, when they leave, that's when you really see it. That's when they really see it as well. That's when they really appreciate it. Shira?
Yeah, a friend of mine just told me she was speaking to Makubal, and she was just saying she's concerned with her daughter, who's, not a teenager yet, but she's dressing, not so modestly. And Makubal said, you need to cover your hair in the house, and you need to be modest wherever you are. And she started doing that, kind of what you're saying now. Our kids see everything that we're doing, and it's going to affect them.
I know someone very well who was never going to cover her hair like that.
Are you talking about me?
Not at all. Not at all.
Oh.
No. Much more intently than anything you would have ever said. Never going to cover her hair. Her mother doesn't cover her hair. She was never going to cover her hair. And then she had a child, and the child had autism. And they also went to some big, I don't know who, rabbi, Makubal, someone. And the rabbi said to her, if you cover your hair, the child will be fine. And she said, do I have to wear she would wear cap sleeves, and her skirts were a little short. She said, do I have to cover my knees? Do I have to cover my elbows? He said, you have to cover your hair. He said, if you cover your hair, your child will be fine. And she did. She has such a good wig that I didn't even realize it was a wig, if you can imagine. I think the first hair she takes out, but she just blends it right into the wig. And she's covered her hair ever since. And her child is no longer autistic. He literally lost that classification.
What?
Yes.
Come on, really?
No, I'm very serious.
That's insane. I've never heard of
I just said the
autistic
same
child
thing.
or anyone losing their.
I know these people very well. The child's no longer autistic.
How
He's
long
not
is that
autistic. If you saw
for?
him, you wouldn't realize, which, but I'm saying not only that, he's no longer diagnosed as autistic. He lost that classification. Literally. This is
He never really was autistic for
He was. He
was.
literally was autistic. He literally had the diagnosis. Obviously they also did lots of therapy. I'm not saying they didn't, but this is a literal truth. I mean, I know these people very, very, very well.
It's so crazy because it's so rare to lose a diagnosis like that or not be able to qualify. And there are
that's
stories.
What I'm saying. He doesn't even qualify.
Right. So there are stories, but it's these far-flung, supposedly a family in Minnesota kind of stories that you hear. So
Right.
it's so incredible.
And this is someone I know very well. Personally, I'm not saying a story of a story. This is someone I know very, very well. And yes, and again, I'm not saying they didn't do therapy, but he does not have the diagnosis anymore. And if you met him, you would
Even with
never
therapy, I've never heard of anyone who just loses it. So
he literally lost the diagnosis, which they're ecstatic. They're not like, oh, we lost the services. They're ecstatic.
of course.
But he lost the diagnosis. He no longer qualifies as an autistic child. I mean, he's
That's
now
remarkable.
never know that any autism. Lost the diagnosis. Now, this class is not specifically, by the way, about covering hair. I wasn't even going to go in that. I mean, I was just thinking about in general the concept. But yes, I was piggybacking off what Shira said, and what Shira's saying was different than what I'm saying, but it's both manifestations of what I was bringing out. What Shira was saying, and again, we don't know what that Makubal meant. Did the makubal mean your modesty will change the energy of the house? Your daughter will breathe in healthier, more spiritual, more wholesome air, and then she will change herself? Does it also mean on the practical level? What you are is a message you're giving to your children. It trickles down, and then consciously or not, they gravitate in your way. As I was saying, I see this with my children even more when they leave the home. Yes, you give them good roots and healthy roots and loving roots and respectful roots, and they do live up to those roots. But what I'm saying here was purely on the spiritual level. It was purely a spiritual thing. And she still does not cover her elbow. She does not cover her knees, but she wears a shaitel. She wears a very beautiful wig.
Covering your hair in your home is just as important as covering it outside.
That's a great question, Miriam. It's not as important, which would mean if someone would say, I'm only going to do one, then she would be told covered outside. But if someone really wants full coverage, full protection, like, you know, when you
Full
get
insurance, yeah.
you could get just liability, just this, just that. You want full coverage. If you want full coverage, then we have full coverage, and we covered in our homes as well. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Shira?
Okay, wait, but Fern, I have one more thing to say about this hair thing.
Sure.
Since me and hair tourniquets is just a very big thing in my life, I'm not even joking. Yesterday, I was changing my baby's diaper, and there was a hair wrapped around his penis. I'm not even kidding. And I was like, oh my God, Hashem, are you seriously testing me again? This is the third time. This is not normal. And in Florida, I was a little more lax with not being as totally covered. I went swimming. I was just more like, okay, we're outside for a second, no big deal. And I kind of looked at it as like, thank God it came off, but it was really, really frightening. And it just triggered all those, memories of the past, tourniquets that whatever. It was really, really bad. And I just told myself, okay, Hashem wants to give me more bracha. And he's just giving me a sign right now. He can't give it to me unless I do this mitzvah. And it's just so strong in my life, and it's so clear to me that like I'm scared to go. I just keep these reminders, and it just reminds me of what you're saying now, that like you gotta just cover your hair. It's gonna bring so much bracha, and yeah, it's just very, very scary.
Can I ask you, when this happened with your baby, was that when you were being lax? Like, was it the same time?
Right. It was right after we were
wow.
in Florida last. Got back Sunday, and it happened yesterday.
Oh wow. Oh wow.
It's just only me. Like, it's not normal to have 3 hair tourniquets on, 2 different kids. It's like a fluke. And how do you get 3 flukes?
It also is an neshama thing, meaning every person has to cover their hair. Every person, it brings blessings. But you could say some souls even more, or some people are just more, or some people are in a space that God will send them very direct signs, and maybe someone else needs to cover their hair just as desperately, but they're not in a relationship with God that they're going to get the messages as clearly.
Right. No, this was very, very clear. I was like, okay, I know. I went swimming without my hair covered, even though it was my own pool. I went outside with a baseball hat and not fully covered like I promised you I would. We're back in the same house. We had a last tourniquet on the hair, and then this happens. And it was very, very clear to me. So it's not worth lacking off. And
But how do you know when it's a sign?
it was just so clear. I don't know. It was
What if it?
You know what, Kayla? It's very interesting. Nothing to do with covering hair. My daughter, who of course is like her mother and father because she got 50% of her genes from one and 50% of the genes of the other, but somehow each child becomes her own independent person. So she is doing something I don't think either of us would ever do. She's doing what's called Shvil Yisrael, if any of you know what that means, which means she's hiking the entire Israel. She's been doing it since after the holidays. So October, November, December, January, now we're in February. She'll be done in about 2 weeks. Meaning she gave like 5 months to be literally acquiring Israel with hiking with her feet. That's just the backstory. So she's really invested in the hike. She's got only 2 weeks left. She's in the south, which is the hardest part of the hike. She's with 2 other girls, 2 other religious girls, crazy hand to God. She did most of the hike herself. And now, like towards the end, the southern half, which is the harder half, she connected with 2 other religious girls, unbelievable hand of God, and they're hiking together. This past Shabbos, she was by my son in Tzfat. For Shabbos, she can't be on the trail, and for whatever reason, she went up to Tzfat. And Sunday, she was going to take now a 6-hour bus ride she's all the way in the north to go all the way in the south. She's a 2-week hike away from Eilat. And right before she went on this very early Sunday morning bus, suddenly her phone stopped working. She's like, oh my gosh, I can't be on a hike without a phone. So my son, she went to my son's in Tzfat. He's like, okay, whatever, just here, take my phone. Whatever, whatever I'll do. You can't be on a hike without a phone. No problem. She has to go on the hike. She has his phone. She gets on the bus and suddenly she just feels like unbelievably ill. She feels so sick. And the bus is going on and she's like, I can't do this. I can't spend the next 6 hours feeling so sick. I can't hike like this. And I have my brother's phone. The whole thing is crazy. She said, God is giving me a message. She got off the bus, turned around, went another bus, comes back to Tzfat. She gets off the bus. Suddenly, her whole illness goes away. She feels perfectly healthy. And when she got off and she comes to my son's house, he's like, weirdest thing. Your phone suddenly started working. And God was telling me, for whatever reasons, this week, take a week off. I know you're only 2 weeks away. I know you want to finish. I know you're hiking with 2 other girls. I want you to spend this week in Tzfat. Horrible weather in the south, so she probably wouldn't be able to hike anyway. But it was just very interesting. I was just responding to Kayla's question. And I think like Shira, like my daughter, like all of us have had situations where you just know God's telling you something. And maybe everyone around you wouldn't like, whatever. It happened to be that your phone stops working and you feel sick and then you happen to feel better and your phone happens to start working. Yeah, possibly. But when you're living it, it's like God's giving me a message. Dorit.
I wanted to ask, when people say a kosher home, not a kosher home, a modest home, what does that really mean? Is that really like the people in the house and how they dress and how they behave and, carry themselves? Or is it something more physical in the house? Like, what does it really mean when people say you have or you don't have a modest house?
That's a great point. And I think it really depends on, again, is it God giving a verdict or is it humans? If it's humans, there could be a lot of different things they could be looking at. They could say a modest house, meaning it's not ostentatious. It's discreet, it's modest. You're not flashing your wealth or not wealth, but want everyone else to assume wealth at us. That could be how some people would define a modest home. Some people could define it based on the interactions of the people or the conversations of the people or what they hear on the screens in the house, what comes out, into the air or the dress of the people. All of those are factors that create a modest home. What is God looking at? There's so many aspects and every drop of it helps or harms, depending on what's going on, that energy of that home. That feeling tone. I would go back to what Shira said, that her friend was told by the Mikubal to cover your hair for your daughter's own receptivity to modesty and godliness. There could be a lot of things. I don't know the person. I don't know the Mikubal she was speaking to. So I'm not judging what he meant. And there could be so many levels why that worked. It could just be her zechut. In that merit, this will help your daughter. And that makes perfect sense to me. It also could be, going back to this idea of a modest home, your covering your hair changes the energy of the home. And when your daughter is breathing in that more modest, more God-fearing energy, she'll more easily access her own God-fearing nature. I'm sure we've all had this experience, for good or for bad, that you walk into someone's home and you just feel something in the home. You either could be like a really positive, like, again, it's not what anyone said yet. Nobody said, nobody this. You just like feel warmth, or you feel relaxed, or you feel tension and pressure, or you feel God-fearing. Yes? Am I the only one? Has anyone else here, you can raise your hand, ever really walked into a house and just felt that energy, whatever that energy was in the house? Now, me, Shira, and Dina, but maybe not everyone's feeling. I don't know, because to me it's so obvious. Maybe not everyone's so. Miriam also, okay.
Sorry, what did you ask, Mrs. Turn?
I was saying that when you walk into a house, you can feel its energy. You can feel whatever energy has been.
Sure.
And again, it's not like you know them. It's not that you have your own assumption on what type of people they are. You just feel positive or negative, relaxed or stressed, warm or tight. You just feel the energy of that home. What creates that energy? What the people are doing, what people are saying, what people are thinking, what the people are wearing, what the people are acting. All of that creates the energy of the home. And I think in this concept, when we're talking about the blessings for the children, as well as the model for the children, all of these things impact so strongly. And sometimes you don't even know why you made a decision. Like sometimes you receive something from your parents or even from someone else. You don't even realize where you got this idea from. You don't even know what made you make that decision, but it was something you absorbed. The Baba Torah was once speaking to a group of Bnei Akiva youth leaders. They were youth leaders in Mexico. They'd taken a trip to New York, and one of the stops in their trip was to have an audience with Lubavitcher Rebbe. The head of the youth group, I forget his name, but he went on to be the president and rector of Bar Ilan University. And he tells this. There's a little video of him recounting this memory, this audience, and his question and the Rebbe's answer. And he said that he was the leader of the youth leaders of Bnei Akiva. And they, of course, were trying to reach the Jewish children there in Mexico City and make them feel connected to God, make them feel connected to the Jewish people, make them feel connected to the land of Israel, all the goals of Bnei Akiva. And they felt very discouraged. They felt like wasting our time, we're wasting our effort, we're wasting our resources. Nobody's listening to us. Nobody cares. They come, they eat the snacks, they leave. We don't see any change. They were very, very discouraged. And they said this to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. This was like in the 50s. And the Rebbe said to them, basically, you have no clue. He said to them, and I don't know if he was saying this as a example or if he was actually talking about something that really happened. But he said, imagine it's Shabbat. You're doing a youth group meeting, and he sort of described it, and the man was like, whoa, how did the Lubavitcher Rebbe know how our youth group meetings work? But the Rebbe described exactly how the youth group meeting will be working. Walks in, a new boy, you've never seen him before. Obviously no kippah, from the street, so to speak. And you're like, ooh, you want to go over, you want to introduce yourself, you want to get his name, but you're in the middle of talking, you can't stop now. So you're like, okay, the drasha, when I finish talking to the boys, I'll go, I'll become friendly, and hopefully he'll come back. Anyway, you're talking about the Jewish people. You're talking about the Jewish people are an eternal people. You're talking about our pride and our heritage. You're talking about all these beautiful topics that you talk about to really give the children a sense, I'm a Jew and I'm proud and I'm part of this eternal people. In the middle of your beautiful talk, the boy walks out and you feel so discouraged. He wasn't even interested. He left. I don't have his name. I'll never see him again. And you never see him again. Never comes back. Another failure. The Rebbe says, you don't know. You don't know what happens to that boy. You don't know that he grows up totally secular. What he heard by you is somewhere buried in the recesses of his mind. He doesn't even remember it. If he did, he would have no clue where he heard it. He never knew your name in the first place. The boy grows up. The boy goes through school. The boy's in university. The boy meets a nice Mexican woman, Catholic woman. And they decide they want to get married. And his parents are fine with it. Her parents are fine with it, except that her parents say, well, according to our custom, you have to get married in a church. And the boy's like, fine. Okay. Nobody minds. He's going to get married in the church. And as his wedding day approaches, this might have been actually there was that on his wedding day, he and his bride-to-be, they're going to the church. And as he's about to walk into the church, it suddenly flashes in his mind. It flashes words he heard when he was 6 years old. He has no clue where he ever heard those words. He has no memory of ever going to that Bnei Akiva meeting. But that whole talk, you're part of an eternal people. You're part of the Jewish nation. This is your eternal legacy. It flashes through his mind. He's like, I can't do this. And he breaks it off then and there. And this rector, the president of Bar Ilan, who gave over what he had heard from the Rebbe in the 50s, he said, these words have been my guide ever since. Whenever I'm, whatever I'm doing, whenever I'm interacting with anyone, I always keep that in mind. So for sure, we, with our children, with our family, with people that we are giving to and giving to and giving to, though they might not remember what we said, and they might remember things that have no clue where they heard them. But for sure, as we're saying here, the modesty, the God-fearingness, the acceptance of God's authority, it's almost like it or not, it penetrates. Our words will penetrate, our actions will penetrate, our speech will penetrate, our modesty will penetrate. What we're saying was, it brings blessings to your children, and it's a living example for your children of serving God. It's a visible, constant message. We believe in God and we serve him. Of course, as she was pointing out, it's very much a model for modesty, but it's even more than for modesty. It's for serving God. Because so many things you do that you serve God, your children are not always aware of. It's not always so obvious to them. But this they see. This makes a difference. Now, where do we have this concept of modesty? Where do we get these rules from? So in the Torah is a verse in Parshas Ki Tetzei, chapter 23, verse 14. It's not a verse about women. It's not a verse that's seemingly talking about your clothing or your language. It's a verse about soldiers. And when we're talking about soldiers, we're told, V'yaseh tieh lecha. The Jewish soldier had to have a special piece of equipment, unlike the soldiers of any other army in those days, or probably today. Every Jewish man that was a soldier, of course, was only Jewish men, had to have a personal shovel. Why did the Jewish soldiers need a personal shovel? Well, the verse says very clearly, because here you are, you're fighting a war. You're not in civilization. You're not by your homes where there were, I guess, some version of an outhouse in those days. You're in the fields. So you're going to be like the animals of the field? You're just going to go to the side of the road and your excrement will be on the ground? No. Why not? Because God's in your camp. Because God walks among you. And therefore your camp has to be holy. And therefore, every soldier had to have a shovel. So you can dig, you can cover, and we're not going to see excrement. We're not going to see this in a place where we want God to be. And that is the original source of the commandment of modesty, which tells us something very strong about modesty. It's saying modesty is coming from a sense of God's presence. That's the essence core of modesty. If we think of God's presence here, now, with us, it should change us. It should change us in general, and it should change us in our modesty. And again, we said modesty means dress. Modesty means our thoughts. Modesty means our language. Modesty means our interactions. Where we go, what we do, what we watch, what we listen to. All of those things are an expression of modesty. And wherever we are, when we're envisioning God is with me, I'm in God's presence, it should change how we do what we do, or what we do, or where we go. It should change all of that because we're in God's presence. Sort of like envisioning ourselves as God's billboard. If I'm God's billboard, how do I want to look? If God is with me, where do I want to take him to? You know, if I take him to a place and the place doesn't seem so appropriate, did God leave me? I wouldn't want that. Am I schlepping God to, so to speak, a place where he wouldn't want to be? I don't want that either. That awareness of God's presence, that's the core of modesty. And again, as I'm saying, it should be the core of our whole relationship with God and our whole life, but very specifically modesty, because we see that's what the Torah is saying. When the Torah wants to teach us the concept of modesty, of course, it teaches us by this law that I said was a culmination of this whole week's Torah portion. But when it's explicitly the source for it, it says, have a shovel for your excrement because God's in your camp. You don't want to chase him away. You want him to feel this is a place where he can be. You want it to be a modest place. Just like it says in a different way, when a person has ego, God can't be there because there's no room for him. Because it's very interesting. We can have a lot of bad qualities. I can think of a lot of bad qualities that I might have. But ego chokes God away. When there's ego, God says, there's no space for me. You're taking up all the space. There's no space for me. I'm checking out of here. So similarly, in the converse with modesty, when it's a space of modesty, God's like, oh, I'm welcomed. You want me here. You're making space for me. You're respecting me. You're respecting my needs. Shira?
What if people have like an ego, but they're really just covering up like an insecurity? I mean, a lot of people have like put on this front of being, you know, all that, but they're really just, they're so insecure that they almost have to like protect themselves. Is that like similar, or is that, can there still
That's an interesting question, because is it ego or is it boasting?
I don't know.
Meaning the reason I'm asking is because there's two, spiritually, our animal soul comes from four elements, as does our godly soul: fire, earth, wind, and water, as does the whole physical world: fire, earth, wind, and water, as do some Snapple bottles: fire, earth, wind, and water. And in the animal soul, which means in the negative way, fire is ego. Fire is arrogance. Fire is a sense of self. Wind is not ego. Wind is boasting. Wind is the need for your voice to be heard. And you think, well, don't they sort of go hand in hand? Like if you have a lot of ego, obviously you're always talking about yourself. Maybe, but not necessarily. A person could have a lot of ego and wouldn't talk about himself. Like, why would I talk about myself to you? A person could not have an ego at all and have a lot of wind. And they really need their voice to be heard. They want to make a lot of noise. They want people to listen to them. It's not the pleasure of self-importance. It's the pleasure in impressing other people with your self-importance. So I'm wondering what you're saying in that person. If they don't feel secure in themselves, it's not ego. But if they're covering it over with something that seems like ego, it might be wind. It might be the need to make a lot of noise, the need to impress other people. And maybe I have such a dire need because I don't feel very full in myself. Miriam?
I don't know if this is the same thing or not, but like people who are very generous with their money, let's say, but at the same time, they want their names all over every single building, this one has, that's ego to me. Let's do things humble. Why can't we go back to that and just give the money, you want to, but put your name everywhere. I don't know. I don't know.
agree.
So that's an
100%.
interesting point because
I agree. I think that's more of the boasting part of like making a ruckus, like want everybody to know that I donated that or our family did that. But I think what Sheer was referring to, correct me if I'm wrong, Sheer, but when you feel like people have this sense of ego because they're hiding their insecurity, I don't really see it in a boasting kind of way. It's more of, I don't know. I've been trying to think about it since Sheer brought it up when you asked, like how to describe it, but I feel like it's done differently.
I want to go back to what Miriam said because I want to look at that from a slightly different angle. I totally understand what you're saying about people giving money and the cover, the honor, but at the same time, we are told it's good to give money and be honored at the dinner or have your name on the building if this will inspire other people to give. So I'm not judging anybody. I don't know anybody, to be honest. I for sure can't judge them. I don't even know them. I don't even know their names. But if there are people in the city or in any city that give a lot and they're honored by a lot of dinners and their names are all over the place, you have no clue. It could be, and I have no clue for sure, I don't even know who they are. It could be that this is almost like a peer pressure, making other people feel they should also give. If so-and-so gives and I don't give, I feel, or even, whoa, I want all that honor too. I want a dinner too. I want my name in big lights too. Great, you're giving charity. People have a need and you're giving. And if you would only give for that reason, we're glad you give. You'd be like, well, that's not for a very high honor, as someone once said to the Alter Rebbe. So this goes back, I don't think there were dinners in those days or names on buildings, but someone said to him something like, I don't think when I give charity, I feel so like, good about myself in that way, like, full of myself, like, maybe I should, like, I don't know, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel very kosher. And the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad, answered him, but the poor man's stomach is still full. So you know what? Maybe it's not the best way to give charity. Maybe it's not from the purest motives. Maybe it's very not altruistic, but the poor man got fed. So whenever we see that, I'm just sharing that. I totally understand where you're coming from, Miriam. And I think that's a thought we could think for ourselves in terms of wanting to be discreet, not wanting people to know about it. And you would be surprised. But maybe sometimes somebody would say to you, if you were in that position, I really want people to know that you gave this money because it will really help other people give. And you're like, no, I don't want people to know. If people know, they'll ask me for more money. I don't want to be hounded by people. And they'll say, but you know what? Maybe you could sacrifice a little and maybe we can make a dinner for you. Maybe we can put your name up because I think it'll get other people to give.
But even appeal, I don't know. Maybe it's just me. I can't stand it. I don't want to know what everybody gives. Just give whatever you want. But why do we have to know how much you gave? And I know what you're saying, that maybe somebody will hear it and then they'll give even more. But I don't know. It just doesn't seem very modest to me, or I don't know. I've always
I hear you. And I totally hear you. I'm just presenting another side. I'm not disagreeing with your side. No, I'm just saying it's multifaceted. I will say my my son is purchased and is renovating a very, like, I mean, for his, budget of very, $1.5 million building in Springfield, Illinois. For him, that's a tremendous amount of money he has to raise. And the person that's been his biggest donor so far, that basically, gave the biggest contribution for him to build his mikvah, is a very modest person. I've seen him, I know him, I've spoken to him, like really modest, humble guy. In honor of this building, he contributed, a very nice amount for someone who, he's not like, it's not like easy. He really, pulled deep out of his pockets to give the amount. And then he agreed. He flew to New York. My son made like a small little, like, I guess, fundraising dinner there. And he spoke to the people. And he really spoke to them about, he didn't speak about, I gave this and this amount of money, but he spoke about when he gives charity. And, it's not easy for him either. I mean, everything's relative, but like he really sees, he gives and God gives back, and he gives more and God gives back more. And the more he's been giving, the more God's been giving him back. And then he said he would match all of their donations, whatever they would donate, he would match for this cause. And I know him. He wasn't doing it for recognition. He wasn't doing it for honor. He wasn't doing it, for everyone to think he's so wonderful. He really did it to inspire people to give charity and to inspire people to give to this building. So I'm just saying, maybe it's very unusual. He's a very nice, honestly, he's a very humble, modest guy. He really is. And yet he did something very uncomfortable for himself, and he spoke publicly about it. And it wasn't to hundreds of people, it was to a small group of people, but he spoke about it really with the vision to inspire them to give more charity, and specifically, to help them give to this cause. So, but again, I understand what you're saying completely. I'm just saying there's various aspects. Shira.
Yeah, I totally agree with Miriam. It's uncomfortable, and why do you just show off what you have? Hashem gave it to you, and that's it. But I've been at, my husband been through a lot of different campaigns, and I did see that it almost like turns into a competition. Like, oh, so and so gave this much. Oh, I'm known to be wealthier, I should give more. And it's crazy, but like that's kind of how it is. Like kind of what you're saying, that everybody kind of like almost like competes. If they're giving that, I should give more, and that's how, I guess, the money that's how the numbers get higher. But that's unfortunately how it is.
And in the end of the day, the poor person's fed. At the end of the day, this goal is reached. But again, I'm not all disagreeing with you, Miriam. I'm not disagreeing. I hear totally what you're saying, and then I totally see the other side. And within the other side, it could be a pure ego trip, or it could be maybe this is very unusual, but this very special person who is a humble person, who does not have a fancy house, does not drive a fancy car, is humble in general, and really went public, really was speaking to people just to try to get them to also give. He wasn't saying how much I give. He was saying how much, when he gives, he sees how the money comes back manifold. But I think what Miriam was bringing out, which is why she said it, getting us back to what we're talking about here, is another example of modesty. I think that was Miriam, your original point. And she's totally right. Modesty is on so many levels. And it's almost like, oh my gosh, how am I going to remember to be modest in my thoughts, and modest in my speech, and modest in what I watch, and modest in what I listen to, and modest in how I give my charity, and modest in what I dress, and modest in my hair, and how am I going to do all this? It goes back to that same core. If modesty is an expression of your awareness of God inside of you, then that awareness of God affects all of these levels. Like an artificial list. Oh, wait, what about my elbows? Oh, wait, what about my charity? It's natural, it's organic to this sense of God's presence. When I'm feeling God's presence, I'm conscious of him, and I'm going to speak differently, and I'm going to do things differently. I'm going to interact with people differently because I'm really conscious of him. And that is what the Torah is telling us in this core definition of modesty, going back to the soldier with his shovel. Not to the woman at her elbows, to the soldier on his shovel. And it's very interesting because, of course, as we all know, in the world today and in the world always, war is a time when you'd have the least modesty. It's a very almost like primitive, very visceral experience, very animalistic experience, warfare. It's not refined, civilized, modest. And God said, there, those soldiers, yes, exactly when you're in that space where you're in your least modest. And of course, we know, oh, the language of sailors, the language of soldiers, of course. It's not just a stereotype, it's real. Because the very warfare mindset, if you're fighting a war or you're waiting for a war to happen, it's a very animalistic, crude atmosphere. And that's where God is saying, I want your shovels. Within there, in that space, I want you to have those shovels. I want you to always remember God is with you. So when we try to give this to our children, we try to give this to our children most strongly by our personal example. And then also talking about it, which of course the talk has to be in sync with our personal example. And when we remember the core of the commandment, when we remember the why behind the commandment, is much easier to keep than when you only know the outer reason. And this goes back to what Miriam said, I don't know, however many minutes ago. She said, like, so you're supposed to cover your hair also in your house. And again, if you're only going to cover it one place, cover it outside. But ideally, yes. It was very interesting to me. I was speaking about hair covering with a class of women that are coming closer to orthodoxy, each one in their own road. And I was like thinking, even, why am I doing this class? Like they're so far from covering their hair. It wasn't even like in my ballpark, like, let's get a mezuzah up, let's get kosher, let's get Shabbat. I was just, to be honest, it was a number of years ago, and I was asked in this group to give a class on covering your hair, and we did a few part series. And I guess I was really in the headspace of it then. So I did one class with them as well. And I was really surprised, but a number of them really took on hair covering from it. And one of the women said to me, she said, is it okay? She said she's just going to cover it in her house. And I said, really? That's so unusual. People are going to anything. She said, no, outside she's not comfortable. What people will say, what people will think. But she realizes how important it is for her children, and she really wanted to do it for her children. So she resolved in her house she was covering her hair. So does that count? I said, of course it counts. Every minute you're covering your hair counts. And it's beautiful. And I remember that actually another woman said to me, said, I can't handle, cover my hair now. I'm going through menopause. It's so hot. I said, when my menopause is over, I'll cover my hair. And I said, okay. And I didn't really know if she would, because, when your menopause is over. And she just recently started covering her hair. I was like, wow. She got a wig. She got another wig. And she comes on class, she's wearing a wig, or she's wearing like a hat, and she's really covering her hair. And it's just so unbelievably beautiful to see a woman who does not keep many other laws. She doesn't. But she's covering her hair. She knows what it means for her children. She knows what it means for her grandchildren. She's covering her hair. But again, when we remember the inner core, it's much easier to keep the details. And of course, also as women, there's our whole essence energy is malchus. It's a state of being. It's nobility, royal, sovereignty, dignity, gracious, genteel. That's a godly space. That's a modest space. There's a story with the Lubavitcher Rebbe's wife, Rebbe Chaim Mushka, that once, and most people didn't even know what she looked like. Before she passed away, the average person didn't know what she looked like. She was very modest and very to herself, and people really didn't know who she was. And once somebody who she was close to passed away. So Rebbe Chaim Mushka went to pay, as we call it, a shiva call, to be Menachem Avil, to come to the house of the mourner. And she came in, and the woman, who was also an older woman, the woman that was sitting shiva, wasn't there. Maybe she was resting for a few minutes. Maybe she was on a phone. She wasn't there. Okay, so Rebbe Chaim Mushka sat. She sat for a few minutes. She waited. The woman did not show up, and she left. I'm sure we've all probably had that experience at one point in our life, where you go to be Menachem Avil someone, and the mourner doesn't happen to be in the room, and you wait. Maybe you wait a half an hour, and they. It's an experience we've all probably had at some point or another. And after she left, the woman eventually came back, and the other people that were in the room said, oh, someone special came to comfort you. And she said, really, who? And they said, we don't know. We don't know her name. They said, well, so what do you mean someone special? They said, no, just the way she was sitting. Just her presence, we felt she was royalty. So when the woman heard this, the woman understood, oh, it must be Rebbe Chaim Mushka, and it was. But it's very interesting. They didn't know who she was. So it wasn't like, well, they knew who she was, so therefore they looked at her that way. They didn't say it was the way she was dressed. It wasn't her clothing. It was her aura. It was something in her aura that they felt it. And when we are in tune with that malchut, with that malchus, with that inner nobility, royalty, which is not, I mean, we're Americans. We might feel really weird with those words. We might feel not comfortable with those words, but that's really our inner self. When we really think of it like we're God's child. We're supposed to be, as I said, his billboard, expressing his energy. Sometimes it helps if you think of someone you know who acts like this, to sort of help you align yourself with this idea. If it feels foreign to you, if you feel no, I'm American, I don't relate to any of this. Americans don't want to be royal. They don't want to be dignified. They don't want to be genteel. They want to be Americans, relaxed. I was like, yeah, but guess what? You're a Jew, and you have all of this inside of you, and you can really pull it out. It's important for you. It's important for the people around you. You're giving them a window into a godly life. I guess I will stop at this point. I obviously did not cover what I wanted to discuss tonight. And I said in the beginning, we'll see if we will continue this next week or will not. But thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for the participation. That's what makes a class alive and real and meaningful. So I so appreciated it. And I hope.
Just curious, what were you going to talk about?
Well, I had much more to say about this theme. You know, I just started it because we
Was it modesty?
had a very wonderful discussion. That's the best thing to have in a class.
But it was modesty in the Kohanim, and that's what
bringing it into ourselves and dimensions and understanding the maybe to be continued next week. Not about the priests, about us, but I really started with that idea of the priest because it struck me so strongly that this is how God ends the Torah portion of the giving of the Torah. You know, the last verse is like the culmination, the climax, the ending note. And this is the ending note of this portion of the giving of the Torah. It's like saying, yeah, guys, yeah, it's that important. You want to be God's temple? You want your home to be God's temple? Only a ramp. A very, very simple and loud, powerful message that we're being told by that verse. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope there'll be as we say, pu'ula nimshechet. I hope each one of us in our heart will be able to think, how do I carry this over? For me as God's temple, for my home as God's temple, for my children, for the children I'm going to have, for the children I have that aren't currently in my home but are still affected by me and the energy. What am I going to do about it? Thank you.